The Art of War. Winning without fighting. Sun Tzu's timeless strategies for your mind and inner life. Audiobook edition, Your Mind and Inner Life. Roko. Narrator's note. This is the Your Mind and Inner Life edition of The Art of War, Winning Without Fighting. Each of Sun Tzu's 13 chapters has been applied specifically to your inner world, your thinking patterns, emotional responses, self-knowledge, decision-making, and the internal battles that shape every external outcome. Throughout this audiobook, you will encounter field notes sections. These are practical reflection prompts. When you hear a field notes section, consider pausing the recording to think through the questions, or return to them after the chapter ends. They are designed to move you from listening to doing. Introduction. Why a 2,500-year-old book about war is the most useful thing you'll hear this year. There is a book that has been continuously in print for over 2,000 years. It has been carried into battle by generals, studied in the boardrooms of the world's most successful companies, and quoted by thinkers, leaders, and philosophers across every culture that has encountered it. It is 63 pages long. It was written by a Chinese military strategist sometime around 500 BC. And almost nobody has applied it to the battle that matters most, the one inside their own head. This audiobook is an attempt to change that. The Art of War by Sun Tzu is not really about war. It uses the language of armies and generals because those were the stakes of Sun Tzu's world. But the underlying subject is something far more universal: how to think clearly, act effectively, and navigate conflict and complexity without being defeated by your own impulses, patterns, and blind spots. The battlefield Sun Tzu describes has always had an internal version. In many ways, it is the more consequential one. Why this book for the mind? Most self-help approaches to the inner life focus on what to think, positive beliefs, affirmations, mindset shifts. Sun Tzu does something categorically different. He focuses on how to think, on the discipline of honest assessment, strategic patience, knowing when to act and when to wait, understanding your own vulnerabilities before they are used against you. These are not soft skills. In Sun Tzu's framing, they are matters of life and death, the difference between a mind that navigates difficulty effectively and one that defeats itself before any external opponent has a chance. The world has changed in ways that make Sun Tzu's thinking more relevant to inner life than ever. The pace of information has made impulsive reaction the default. The constant demands on attention have made deep, honest thinking increasingly rare. The pressure to perform, to appear certain, to act quickly, works directly against the kind of clear self-knowledge that Sun Tzu insists on as the foundation of everything. What this audiobook is. This is the Your Mind and Inner Life edition. Each of Sun Tzu's 13 original chapters is brought to life through the lens of your inner world, your decision-making, your emotional patterns, your self-knowledge, your relationship with obstacles, and the internal conditions that determine whether everything else in your life goes well or badly. Each chapter opens with the original wisdom, a faithful, plain-language account of what Sun Tzu actually said. Following that, you will hear the core principles, a distilled set of the chapter's key ideas. Then comes the heart of each chapter, a direct, specific application of Sun Tzu's thinking to your inner life. Every chapter closes with field notes, practical reflection prompts designed to move you from listening to doing. A note on Sun Tzu. Very little is known with certainty about Sun Tzu himself. The name may refer to a single historical figure, a general named Sun Wu who served the king of Wu in ancient China around 500 BC, or it may be a composite identity. What is not in dispute is the text itself, its extraordinary compression of insight into how human beings think, decide, and defeat themselves. One last thing before we begin. Sun Tzu opens The Art of War with a statement of the highest seriousness: the art of war is of vital importance. It is a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or ruin. He is not being dramatic. He is insisting on a quality of attention that most people reserve for very few things in their lives. Your inner life deserves that quality of attention. The person who navigates it most wisely is not the one with the best intentions. They are the one who thinks most honestly about what is actually happening inside. The battlefield is different now. The principles are not. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Laying plans. Think before you move. Calculate before you commit. Prepare before you act. The general who wins a battle makes many calculations before the battle is fought. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The original wisdom. Sun Tzu opens The Art of War with a statement of the highest seriousness. The art of war is of vital importance, a matter of life and death, a road either to safety or to ruin. In other words, don't take this lightly. Before a single soldier moves, he insists on 5 fundamental factors that determine the outcome: the moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, and method and discipline. In plain language, do your people believe in what they're fighting for? What conditions are outside your control? What is the actual terrain? Is your leader trustworthy? And is there a clear, disciplined plan for execution? Sun Tzu's key insight is that the general who answers these 5 questions honestly wins before the battle begins. Victory is manufactured in preparation, not discovered in the middle of a crisis. There's also a line often overlooked: all warfare is based on deception. Sun Tzu doesn't mean lie to everyone. He means, don't show your full hand before you need to. This is not manipulation, it's strategic patience. The entire first chapter is a case for one habit: thinking before acting. Most people lose not because they lack talent or resources, but because they act before they have properly assessed the situation. Sun Tzu saw this 2,500 years ago. Nothing has changed. The core principles. Every important endeavor deserves serious analysis before you begin. Treat your plans as a matter of consequence, not an afterthought. 5 things determine outcomes: belief in the cause, external conditions, the terrain, the quality of leadership, and the discipline of execution. The side that answers these questions most honestly wins before the contest starts. Victory is manufactured in preparation, not discovered in the middle of a crisis. Don't reveal your full strategy prematurely. Strategic patience is a form of power. Recklessness dressed up as boldness is still recklessness. Applying it in your mind. The enemy Sun Tzu doesn't name explicitly, but who appears on every page, is impulse. Most of the bad decisions in your life probably weren't made in the middle of deep reflection. They were made quickly, emotionally, and without honest self-assessment. You said yes to the wrong thing because the opportunity felt exciting in the moment. You quit something good because a difficult week made it feel impossible. You stayed in something bad because leaving required a plan, and plans are uncomfortable. Sun Tzu's 5 factors applied to inner life become 5 honest questions to ask before any major decision. Do I genuinely believe in what I'm committing to, or am I acting on excitement or fear? What are the conditions outside my control that I need to account for? What is the actual terrain I'm operating on? What are the real constraints? Do I have the temperament and capability this particular endeavor requires? And is there a clear, disciplined plan, or am I relying on motivation to carry me through? Most people ask one of these questions, at most 2. The person who asks all 5 honestly, and acts on the answers rather than the answers they wish they had, makes categorically better decisions than the person operating on enthusiasm alone. There's also a practical application of the deception principle for your own mind. Don't announce your intentions to yourself before you're ready to act on them. The internal declaration, "This time I'm really going to change this," produces a small burst of positive feeling that can actually reduce the motivation to do the hard thing. Thinking through the plan quietly, without fanfare, and then simply beginning, is often more effective than the announcement. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Before your next important decision, write down your answers to the 5 factors. Be specific and honest. Do I genuinely believe in this, or is it excitement or avoidance talking? What are the conditions outside my control that I need to account for? What is my honest assessment of my capabilities for this specific endeavor? Write them down. Make a simple rule: no major decisions when you haven't answered all 5 honestly. The person who wins most consistently is not the most talented, the most motivated, or the most determined. They are the one who thinks longest and most honestly before they move. Chapter 2. Waging War. Every internal campaign has a cost. The longer it runs unresolved, the more it takes from you. In war, let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Sun Tzu opens his second chapter with sobering numbers: the cost of keeping an army in the field too long. It doesn't just cost money. It costs spirit, sharpness, and the will to keep going. This chapter is not really about war. It is about the hidden cost of prolonged effort, and why speed, efficiency, and knowing when to end something are just as important as knowing how to fight. Sun Tzu's prescription is blunt: let your great object be victory, not lengthy campaigns. He is not saying rush carelessly. He is saying that speed of resolution, when paired with adequate preparation, is itself a form of excellence. There is a deeper wisdom underneath all of this. Human energy is finite, it depletes faster under stress than we expect, and once it is gone, it does not come back quickly. Protecting it is not laziness. It is strategy. The core principles. Every internal conflict, unresolved decision, and stalled goal has a cost, and that cost compounds the longer it runs. Speed of resolution, when backed by honest self-assessment, is a mark of psychological maturity. Cognitive and emotional energy are finite resources that must be managed as carefully as any external asset. Prolonged internal battles change you, often for the worse, regardless of whether you are winning or losing them. The goal is genuine resolution, not the performance of effort or the appearance of working on yourself. Knowing when to close something, a decision, a resentment, a stalled aspiration, is one of the most underrated inner life skills. Applying it in your mind. The battlefield Sun Tzu describes in this chapter exists inside your head too, and it may be the most exhausting campaign of all. Mental prolonged conflict takes many forms. The decision you have been turning over for months without resolving. The resentment you carry about something that happened years ago, relitigating it in your mind on quiet evenings. The goal you are working toward that you have not made real progress on in so long that it has become more of a background anxiety than an actual pursuit. Each of these is a supply line stretched far from home. They consume energy, quietly, constantly, without producing anything. Psychologists sometimes call this cognitive load, the background processing cost of unresolved mental items. Sun Tzu would just call it what it is: a long campaign that is bleeding your resources. The most valuable mental habit from this chapter is what might be called active closure, the discipline of resolving open loops rather than letting them run indefinitely. This does not mean forcing decisions before you are ready. It means recognizing that "I'll think about it later" is often the beginning of a years-long internal campaign, and asking whether you can create a real resolution now. There is also something important here about how you manage your energy across a day. Sun Tzu notes that a soldier's spirit is keenest in the morning and fades as the day progresses. Your deepest work, the thinking, creating, and deciding that matters most, deserves your freshest hours, not the depleted scraps at the end of a day spent in meetings and emails. Matching your hardest work to your sharpest state is logistics thinking applied to yourself. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Write down 3 open loops in your mind right now: decisions unmade, resentments unprocessed, goals stalled. For each one, decide, can I resolve this in the next week? If yes, schedule it. If no, make a conscious decision to set it aside until a specific future date, and actually put that date somewhere you will see it. The measure of an internal campaign is not how hard you fought, it is how efficiently you reached resolution and how much you had left when it was over. Chapter 3. Attack by Stratagem. The greatest internal victory is the one that requires no fight at all. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. The third chapter is about something more elegant than defeating opponents, winning without the battle ever happening. Sun Tzu ranks the methods of victory in order. The highest is to attack the enemy's strategy, to understand their plan and neutralize it before it unfolds. The worst of all options is to besiege a walled city, slow, costly, unpredictable, the last resort of a general who has run out of better ideas. Then comes one of the most quoted lines in the book: if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Knowing yourself, your actual strengths, your real weaknesses, your genuine limits, is the hardest and most strategically important work you can do. The chapter ends with one underlying idea: think your way to victory before you fight your way there. Force is the last tool, not the first. The core principles. The greatest internal victory is often the conflict that never escalates into full confrontation, the emotion understood before it fires, the pattern interrupted before it runs. Attack the internal strategy, not the symptom. Understand what is driving a reaction before you respond to the reaction itself. Know yourself clearly, your patterns, triggers, genuine needs, and genuine limits, as a strategic priority, not a self-improvement project. The methods of internal resolution rank from highest to lowest: understand, reframe, respond, and only then, if necessary, fight. Most internal battles are made worse by people who have a genuine blind spot about their own role in creating them. Applying it in your mind. The enemy you most need to defeat without fighting is often the one inside your own head. Sun Tzu's ranking of strategies: outthink, outmaneuver, negotiate, and only then fight, maps onto the relationship between your rational mind and your emotional reactions with uncomfortable precision. When a strong emotion arises, anxiety before a difficult conversation, anger at a perceived slight, shame after a mistake, your first instinct is to fight it, suppress it, or be overwhelmed by it. None of these is the highest order approach. The attack the strategy move in your own psychology is to understand the emotion before you react to it. What is the anxiety actually about? Not "I'm nervous about this presentation," but what specifically am I afraid will happen, and how likely is that actually? Not "I'm angry at this person," but what did I need in this situation that I didn't get, and is my anger pointing at the real source? The know yourself principle, applied internally, is about developing genuine clarity on your own patterns of thought and reaction, not to judge them, but to be less at their mercy. The person who knows they catastrophize when tired makes different decisions at 11 p.m. than the person who doesn't. The person who recognizes their tendency to people please when under social pressure can catch themselves before they agree to things they will resent. Self-knowledge, in Sun Tzu's framing, is not a luxury. It is operational intelligence about your most important asset, yourself. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify one emotional pattern that consistently costs you, a reaction that tends to make situations worse rather than better. Describe it specifically. What triggers it? What does it feel like in the moment? What do you typically do when it is active? Then ask, what would attacking the strategy look like, addressing the underlying thing before the reaction fires? Before you fight the feeling, exhaust every option that doesn't require it, because the internal battle you avoid cleanly costs you nothing, while the one you wage badly can cost you everything. Chapter 4. Tactical Positioning. Before you try to win, make sure you cannot lose. The good fighters of old first put themselves beyond the possibility of defeat. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 4 shifts from defeating opponents to something far less glamorous and far more important: making yourself undefeatable first. The sequence matters enormously. First, invulnerability. Then, opportunity. Not simultaneously. Not the other way around. Sun Tzu introduces strategic advantage, potential energy. Water held behind a dam. A boulder perched at the top of a mountain. The energy is not being used yet, but it is there, fully loaded, waiting. A well-positioned general does not need to fight hard because the position itself does most of the work. The whole chapter is a case for one underappreciated truth: the most important work you will ever do is the work nobody sees, the preparation, the positioning, the quiet building of foundations that makes everything else possible. The core principles. Make yourself impossible to destroy before you try to achieve anything. Foundation first, ambition second. The most important personal work is often the least visible: sleep, stability, honest self-knowledge, genuine resilience. Strategic advantage is potential energy, built quietly, held in reserve, available when needed. Knowing the right next step and being positioned to take it are two entirely different things. Investing in capabilities before you need them is the highest leverage personal development work available. Applying it in your mind. The internal version of tactical positioning is one of the most undervalued ideas in personal development, and one of the most practically powerful. Most people think about personal growth as accumulation: learn more, do more, achieve more. Sun Tzu's framing suggests a different question: how unassailable is your base? Before you chase the next goal, take on the next challenge, or push into the next level of anything, how secure is the foundation you are operating from? Mental and physical health are the most obvious dimensions of this. The person who is consistently sleep-deprived, nutritionally depleted, or carrying unexamined anxiety is waging every campaign from a compromised position. They might win some battles through sheer will, but they are doing it with a leaking supply line, and eventually the leak catches up. Building the base here means the unglamorous basics: sleep, movement, real food, genuine rest, and honest engagement with the psychological patterns that are costing you without your full awareness. But there is a deeper version of this principle too. Sun Tzu says the good fighter puts themselves beyond the possibility of defeat before seeking victory. In psychological terms, this means developing the internal stability to pursue what matters without being catastrophically undone by setbacks, criticism, or failure. This is not toughness in the performative sense. It is the genuine security that comes from knowing clearly who you are, what you value, and what you are willing to stand behind, independent of external validation. The Shi principle applied to personal development is about investing in capabilities before you need them. The person who has developed genuine resilience practices, not read about them, but built them, enters a hard period from a different base than the one who has not. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify the single most significant vulnerability in your personal foundation right now, the area where, if things got harder, you would be most exposed. It might be physical, psychological, financial, or relational. Ask, what is one concrete thing I could start doing this week to strengthen this specific area? Then schedule it, rather than leaving it as an intention. The most important investments you will ever make are the ones that mean you cannot be destroyed, because everything you build on top of that foundation stands on solid ground. Chapter 5. Energy and Momentum. It is not just what you do, it is when you do it, and how you set it up. The onset of troops is like the rush of a torrent which will even roll stones along in its course. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 5 is about the quality of force. Not just how much power you have, but how you deploy it. Not just what you do, but the way it hits. Sun Tzu describes the difference between direct force and indirect force, the expected move and the surprise. Direct force engages. But it is almost never what actually wins. What wins is the indirect force, the unexpected angle, the creative maneuver. Then comes strategic energy, the momentum built up by positioning and timing. A boulder released from a mountain height. A hawk striking its prey with timing so precise the strike connects before the prey can react. The difference between force manufactured in the moment and force built through positioning and released at the right instant. The chapter ends with a note on how great commanders seek victory from the situation itself. The skill is in the setup, not the struggle. The core principles. Direct effort engages, indirect setup wins. You need both, in the right sequence. Timing transforms the same action from ordinary to powerful. The same decision made in a resourced versus depleted state produces completely different results. Strategic energy is potential force released at the right moment. It multiplies effort rather than replacing it. The most powerful moves are not manufactured in the moment but built through positioning and released through patience. Create conditions where the behavior you want becomes easier, rather than forcing it through willpower alone. Applying it in your mind. The most exhausting way to live is to manufacture all your momentum from direct effort, to push yourself through everything through willpower alone, with no stored energy and no strategic timing. Most people know this feeling. The project you are forcing. The habit you are trying to maintain through grindstone discipline with no natural momentum behind it. The goal you have committed to publicly but that feels like dragging a boulder uphill every single day. This is direct force without sheer effort, without accumulated energy, and it works until it does not, which is usually at the worst possible moment. The indirect approach in your own psychology is about creating conditions where the behavior you want becomes easier rather than forcing it through resistance. You do not build a reading habit by lecturing yourself about the importance of reading. You build it by putting the book on your pillow every morning, by removing the phone from the bedroom, by creating the environmental conditions where reading is the path of least resistance. The indirect force, the setup, does the work that willpower alone cannot sustain. Timing in personal decision-making is as critical as it is in military strategy. The decision made in a low state, tired, hungry, emotionally flooded, or in the middle of a fear response, is almost always worse than the same decision made from a resourced state. Developing awareness of your own energy cycles, when you are sharp, when you are depleted, when you are emotionally flooded, and deliberately timing important decisions and difficult conversations to your peak states is one of the highest leverage personal practices available. The boulder image is worth returning to for anyone in a long building phase, the slow accumulation before the breakthrough. It does not feel like momentum while it is happening. It feels like repetition and uncertainty. But the energy is real. It is accumulating. And when the moment comes, the force of it will surprise even you. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify one goal or habit you are currently maintaining through willpower and direct effort alone. Ask, what environmental or structural change would make this easier? What indirect setup would reduce the effort required? Then ask, am I making key decisions about this in my best states, or in my worst ones? Adjust accordingly. The most powerful move is rarely the most obvious one, it is the right angle, at the right moment, released from a foundation that was built when nobody was watching. Chapter 6. Weak points and strong. Know where you are genuinely strong. Know where you are genuinely weak. Be honest about both. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 6 is about direction. Sun Tzu's instruction is almost disarmingly simple: go where they are not. He opens with a principle that cuts against every instinct of the direct competitor: the advantage belongs to whoever controls where and when the engagement happens. You can be sure of succeeding if you only engage where you are undefended on the right side, and your opponent is unprepared on theirs. Then comes the water metaphor: water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. Rigidity loses. Adaptability wins. The path to victory always runs through the gaps, not through the walls. The core principles. Your strong points are not just your skills, they are the conditions under which you operate at your genuine best. Your weak points are not character flaws to feel bad about, they are operational intelligence about where difficult situations will find you unprepared. Mapping both with precision is one of the highest leverage personal development activities available. Adaptability is not inconsistency, it is the intelligence to respond to what is actually in front of you rather than running your standard program. Spending your career and energy in territory where you are genuinely strong produces a qualitatively different life from fighting uphill against your own nature. Applying it in your mind. The most important map of weak points and strong points you will ever draw is of yourself, and most people never draw it with real honesty. Your strong points, in Sun Tzu's terms, are not just your skills. They are the conditions under which you operate at your best, the type of problem that energizes you, the environment that brings out your clearest thinking, the kind of pressure that sharpens rather than overwhelms you. Most people have a vague sense of these. The people who perform consistently at high levels have a precise one. They know what they need to do their best work, and they create those conditions deliberately, rather than hoping they will arise accidentally. Your weak points are equally worth mapping with precision. Not as a list of inadequacies to feel bad about, but as operational intelligence. The type of situation that consistently produces your worst decisions. The emotional state that reliably compromises your judgment. The kind of person or dynamic that tends to bring out the least useful version of you. These are your undefended positions, the places a difficult situation will find you unprepared if you have not thought about them in advance. Sun Tzu's water principle applied to personal growth is genuinely liberating if you let it be. Water does not try to flow uphill. It finds the path where its nature is an asset rather than a liability. This is not an argument for avoiding all difficulty. It is an argument for the strategic intelligence of knowing where your effort yields a 10 times return and where it yields almost nothing, and allocating accordingly. The person who spends their life trying to shore up fundamental weaknesses at the cost of developing genuine strengths is fighting uphill against their own nature. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Create a simple, honest inventory. Under strong points, list not just skills but the specific conditions, problem types, and environments where you genuinely excel. Under weak points, list not character flaws but the specific situations, states, and dynamics where you consistently underperform. Then look at how you are currently spending your time and energy. How much is in territory where you are strong? How much is on ground where you are reliably weak? Stop attacking the walls of your own limitations. Find the gate that is already open, because the most efficient path to where you want to go is almost never the most obvious one. Chapter 7. Maneuvering. The obstacle is not in your way. It is the way, if you are willing to think differently about it. Let your rapidity be that of the wind, your compactness that of the forest. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 7 opens with a problem everyone trying to get somewhere meaningful will recognize: the most direct path is rarely the one that actually gets you there. The skill Sun Tzu describes is not finding the direct path and following it. The skill is taking what appears to be a roundabout, indirect, even disadvantageous route, and turning it into your most direct line to victory. Sometimes the detour is the shortcut, and the obstacle is the most important part of the journey. He illustrates this with troops racing ahead without coordination, arriving depleted and unable to capitalize on the position they have just reached. Speed without coordination is not an advantage. It is a new problem wearing the costume of progress. The chapter closes pointing toward the same underlying wisdom: rigidity kills. The person who responds to every situation with the same move is not disciplined. They are brittle. The core principles. The path that appears indirect or disadvantageous is often the most direct route to the real objective. The obstacle that forces adaptation often produces a permanent capability that the smooth path never would have. Cognitive and emotional energy must be routed through your best states for your most important work. Rigidity is a form of brittleness. The ability to work with circumstances rather than against them is one of the highest personal skills. Turning internal obstacles into advantages is not toxic positivity. It is a learnable discipline that requires honest, precise thinking about what is actually available. Applying it in your mind. The internal version of maneuvering is one of the most important and least taught life skills available: the ability to work with your circumstances rather than against them, to find the route through rather than the route around. Most people's relationship with obstacles is binary: either the obstacle gets removed, or the goal gets abandoned. Sun Tzu is pointing at a third option that is almost always available and almost always overlooked: the obstacle gets used. The constraint becomes the creative brief. The setback becomes the data. The loss becomes the recalibration. This is not toxic positivity, the insistence that everything is fine and every difficulty is a blessing in disguise. It is something sharper and more demanding: the discipline of asking what is actually here, and what can be done with it, before defaulting to either denial or despair. The person who loses a job and asks that question with real seriousness often discovers that the clarity forced by the loss reveals something important about what they actually want, which the security of the previous position had made it too comfortable to examine. The energy management principle is perhaps nowhere more important than in the internal domain. Your cognitive and emotional resources are finite, they deplete under stress faster than you think, and they replenish more slowly than you wish. The person who tries to do their most demanding thinking in their depleted states is maneuvering without having assessed the condition of their troops. Building an honest awareness of your own energy cycles, and routing your most important work through your best states, is not laziness. It is the most effective use of the most important resource you have. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify the most significant obstacle you are currently facing in your inner life. Write it at the top of a page. Then spend 10 minutes writing everything this obstacle might be making possible, new directions it forces you to consider, capabilities it requires you to develop, clarity it provides about what actually matters. Don't filter for likelihood. Just generate. The quality of your thinking about obstacles is one of the most reliable predictors of your outcomes. The person who can look at what is blocking them and ask what does this make possible, instead of only how do I remove this, will consistently find paths that the rigid thinker never sees. Chapter 8. Variation of tactics. The rules you hold about yourself may be the most dangerous rigid rules of all. The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace is the jewel of the kingdom. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 8 is one of the shortest in The Art of War, and one of the most unsettling. What Sun Tzu is really saying is that the thing most people rely on most heavily, their established approach, their proven methods, can become the very source of their defeat when conditions change. The underlying principle is radical: no rule is absolute. Every tactical principle was derived from a specific set of conditions. When those conditions change, the rule must change with them. He identifies 5 dangerous character flaws: recklessness, cowardice, quick temper, excessive concern for reputation, and excessive compassion, the ones so focused on avoiding harm to those they care for that they cannot make the hard calls the situation demands. The chapter ends with the ideal: the person who can act correctly, advancing or retreating as the situation demands, free from ego distortions, is the rarest and most valuable kind of person. The core principles. No rule about yourself is absolute. Every self-belief was derived from specific experiences and must be examined when it begins to limit rather than describe. The most dangerous rigid rules are the ones about yourself. 5 character flaws create predictable internal vulnerabilities: recklessness, cowardice, quick temper, excessive concern for reputation, and excessive compassion that prevents necessary action. These are not just vulnerabilities that others exploit, they are vulnerabilities we use against ourselves. The ability to try without needing to look good, and to change course without experiencing it as failure, is one of the most liberating things a person can develop. Applying it in your mind. The most dangerous rigid rules are the ones about yourself. I'm not a morning person. I'm bad at confrontation. I don't have a head for numbers. I need external pressure to get things done. Some of these may be genuinely true, stable features of your nature. But many of them are rules derived from limited evidence, often a few formative experiences, that have calcified into identity before they have been properly tested. Sun Tzu's insistence on variation of tactics, applied internally, is an invitation to examine which of your self-rules are genuinely descriptive and which are simply habitual. The person who decided at 22 that they were not creative based on one art class and a dismissive teacher has been following a road that perhaps should not be followed. The person who has always been bad at difficult conversations and has therefore avoided them for decades has simply never developed the capability that avoidance has prevented, and has mistaken the absence of practice for the absence of aptitude. The 5 character flaws applied to internal life are where this chapter gets most uncomfortable. Because these are not just vulnerabilities that others exploit. They are vulnerabilities we use against ourselves. The internal quick temper, the way we speak to ourselves when we make a mistake, is often more damaging than anything an external critic could deliver. The internal excessive concern for reputation, the constant monitoring of how we appear, the self-editing before we have even acted, is one of the primary mechanisms that keeps people small and safe and unfulfilled. The principle of advancing without coveting fame and retreating without fearing disgrace is perhaps the deepest idea in the chapter. The ability to try something new without needing it to make you look good. The ability to change your mind publicly without experiencing it as humiliation. The ability to stop doing something that is not working without having to construct a narrative that makes the stopping heroic. This is psychological freedom of a kind that most people spend their whole lives approaching but never quite reaching. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Write down 3 rules you hold about yourself, things you believe to be stable, true features of who you are and how you operate. For each one, ask, where did this rule come from? And, when did I last genuinely test whether it is still true, or whether it was ever fully true? Pick the one that, if it turned out to be less fixed than you have assumed, would open up the most. The person who can hold their hard-won rules about themselves loosely enough to set them aside when the situation demands it, without losing their values, is operating at a level that rigid self-belief simply cannot reach. Chapter 9. The Army on the March. Everything inside you is telling you something. The question is whether you are listening. We are not fit to lead an army on the march unless we are familiar with the face of the country. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 9 is unlike anything else in The Art of War. After 8 chapters of strategic principles, Sun Tzu suddenly gets forensically specific about reading a landscape, the gap between what is being presented and what is actually happening. At its heart, this is the most practical expression of his deepest conviction: reality is always communicating with you. He moves to the art of reading signs. When the enemy's troops lean on their spears, they are exhausted. When birds take flight from a position, there is movement hidden beneath them. Each observation is about the same thing, the gap between what is being presented and what is actually true. He then turns to leadership. The greatest commanders earn trust through genuine care, through consistency, through being worthy of the trust they ask for. The chapter closes, consistency between what you say and what you do is the foundation of all functional authority. It is a practice, not a personality trait. And its effects compound. The core principles. Reality communicates constantly through your body, your behavior, and your patterns. Accurate reading of these is a core inner life skill. The gap between your presented internal reality and your actual one is often at least as wide as any external gap you are trying to read. Your body is often the most reliable signal of what is actually happening beneath the narrative you are telling yourself. The consistency between your stated values and your actual behavior is the most important internal intelligence you can gather. Genuine self-attention, not the performance of self-awareness, but the real thing, is one of the rarest and most valuable practices available. Applying it in your mind. The most important environment to read accurately is not the organization you work in or the market you compete in. It is your own internal state, and this is the terrain most people are most consistently inaccurate about. We are remarkably poor self-readers, as a species. We tell ourselves we are calm when our body is in a stress response. We tell ourselves we are fine with something when our behavior is loudly contradicting the claim. We tell ourselves we are motivated and committed to a goal while every action we take is a form of avoidance. The gap between our presented internal reality and our actual one is often at least as wide as the gap Sun Tzu was reading between enemy armies. The skill of accurate self-reading begins with the same discipline Sun Tzu applied to reading terrain, paying genuine attention rather than assumed attention. Not I know roughly how I feel about this, but actually sitting with the question long enough to get a more precise answer. The body is often the most reliable signal: physical tension, disrupted sleep, changes in energy or appetite, the quality of your attention. These are the birds taking flight, the troops leaning on their spears. They are telling you something about the actual state of the territory that your narrative about yourself may not be accurately reporting. The consistency principle applied internally is about the alignment between your stated values and your actual behavior, and the willingness to read the gap between them honestly when it exists. Most people know, at some level, when what they are doing does not match what they say they believe in. The question is whether they let themselves read that signal clearly enough to do something about it, or whether they reach for an explanation that restores the comfortable sense that everything is aligned when it is not. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. For 1 week, practice reading your own indirect signals. At the end of each day, note, what did my body, my energy, my behavior, and my attention tell me today, separate from what I told myself I was feeling? Look specifically for the places where your internal presentation and your internal reality seem to diverge. Those divergences are the most useful information you have about what is actually happening beneath the surface. The most valuable intelligence you will ever gather is available for free, in every moment you inhabit, but only to the person who has learned to pay real attention rather than assumed attention. Chapter 10. Terrain. The same person, the same skills, the same intentions, completely different outcomes depending on the internal ground you are standing on. Know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will never be endangered. Know the ground and the skies, your victory will then be total. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 10 is about something that sounds almost too simple to need a chapter, where you are matters. The ground beneath your feet shapes everything, what moves are available, what risks are acceptable, what the right decision actually is. Sun Tzu catalogs 6 types of terrain, each demanding a completely different approach. What runs underneath all 6 is a single discipline: read the specific situation you are actually in, not the situation you wish you were in, not the situation your standard approach was designed for. Then Sun Tzu identifies 6 ways that armies defeat themselves, and in every case, the cause is not the opponent's strength but the commander's failure. He closes with the line that might be the most important in the chapter: know yourself, know the terrain, know the conditions. All together produce complete victory. The core principles. The internal terrain you carry, your formed beliefs, emotional history, and cognitive patterns, is the ground on which every internal decision is made. Understanding the conditions under which you operate at your genuine best, and your genuine worst, is prerequisite to effective self-leadership. Most personal defeats come not from external circumstances but from internal failures of honest self-assessment. Applying the same approach to yourself regardless of your current internal state is not consistency. It is a failure to read the terrain. The ways we defeat ourselves from within are almost always more consequential than anything an external opponent could do. Applying it in your mind. The terrain you carry inside yourself, the accumulated landscape of your experience, your formed beliefs, your emotional history, is the ground on which every internal decision is made. And most people navigate it almost entirely by feel, without ever having mapped it deliberately. Sun Tzu's insistence on knowing the terrain before committing to a position has a profound internal application: understanding the conditions under which your best thinking, your best decisions, and your best behavior occur, and equally, the conditions that reliably produce your worst. It is about the particular types of terrain, the kinds of situations, pressures, and emotional landscapes, where you are genuinely at your best and worst. Some people think most clearly under moderate pressure but lose quality rapidly when pressure becomes acute. Some people do their best relational work in one-on-one settings and become significantly less effective in groups. Some people navigate ambiguity well but struggle with repetitive, process-heavy work. These are terrain features. They are not permanent limitations and they are not fixed destinies, but they are real, and operating as if they do not exist is the equivalent of marching into entangling ground without having scouted it. The 6 internal failure modes, applied to personal life, point at something uncomfortable but genuinely useful: the ways we defeat ourselves from within, without any external opponent needing to do anything. The insubordination failure shows up internally as the person whose stated values and actual drivers are completely different things. They say they value health and spend their evenings in ways that undermine it. They say they value their family and let work colonize every boundary. The stated authority, the values they identify with, exists, but the real authority, the habits, the fears, the defaults, lies somewhere else entirely. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Map your internal terrain in 2 columns. In the first, describe the conditions under which you operate at your genuine best, the type of problem, the environment, the emotional state, the kind of pressure or support that brings out your clearest thinking. In the second, describe the conditions that reliably produce your worst, the situations, states, and dynamics where you consistently underperform your own standards. Then look at how your current life is structured. How much time are you spending on each type of ground? Context is not the background to your inner life, it is half of it. The person who reads the ground they are actually on, rather than the ground they wish they were on, will consistently make better choices with the same information. Chapter 11. The 9 Situations. There are moments when holding back is the most dangerous thing you can do. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 11 is the longest in The Art of War and, in many ways, the most intense. After 10 chapters of preparation, positioning, adaptability, and restraint, Sun Tzu turns to what happens when the conditions are extreme and the ordinary rules of careful management no longer apply. He catalogues 9 types of ground, from dispersive ground, where soldiers are tempted to scatter and return home, to desperate ground, where survival requires immediate, total commitment. The most striking passage describes what a great general does on desperate ground. He burns the boats. He removes every option except forward. This is the strategic use of desperation, the recognition that human beings perform at their absolute peak when there is no alternative. He returns to the theme of unity, the army that fights as one, where every soldier trusts the others and the whole moves with single purpose, is qualitatively different from the army of individuals. The core principles. The 9 situations are not just external circumstances. They are internal states. The most important desperate ground you will ever stand on is the one inside your own psychology where you finally decide the comfortable option is no longer available. The level of human resourcefulness and genuine change that desperate ground unlocks is qualitatively different from anything comfortable ground produces. Partial commitment to a goal that calls for full commitment produces the worst possible outcome, all of the cost, none of the breakthrough. The internal leadership response to acute difficulty is not to engage every anxious thought, but to identify the one thing that needs to happen next and direct full attention there. Applying it in your mind. The 9 situations are not just external circumstances. They are internal states, and the most important desperate ground you will ever stand on is the one inside your own psychology where you finally decide that the comfortable option is no longer available. Most significant personal transformations follow this structure. The person who finally addresses the health problem they have been managing around for years does not do it because more information arrived. They do it because something shifted internally, the retreat option closed, the comfortable story stopped working, the cost of continuing became undeniable. The person who finally leaves the situation that has been draining them does not leave because conditions changed. They leave because they reached their internal desperate ground, the place where staying became as unacceptable as the difficulty of leaving. This is Sun Tzu's deepest insight in the chapter applied to personal life. The level of human performance, resourcefulness, and genuine change that desperate ground unlocks is qualitatively different from anything that comfortable ground produces. Not better in every way, the stress is real, the cost is real, the difficulty is real. But the clarity is extraordinary. On desperate ground, the irrelevant falls away. The performance of trying stops. The actual question, what do I need to do, right now, to get through this, becomes the only question, and it tends to get answered with a directness and creativity that the comfortable version of the same person could not access. The leadership principle from this chapter has a powerful internal application for the moments when your own mind is generating chaos. The internal leadership response to acute difficulty is not to engage with every anxious thought, explore every catastrophic scenario, or allow the rumor mill of your own cognition to run unchecked. It is to identify the one thing that needs to happen next, and direct your full attention there. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify one area of your life where you have been operating in partial commitment, where the comfortable option is still available and its availability is shaping your choices in ways that are costing you. Ask, what would change in my thinking, my behavior, my daily choices, if that option were genuinely no longer available? Write the answer in detail. Then ask the harder question, is the comfortable option actually serving me, or is its presence the main thing preventing the level of engagement this situation requires? Full commitment is not recklessness, it is the recognition that some things can only be achieved by people who have stopped leaving themselves a way out. Chapter 12. Attack by Fire. Knowing when to act on a strong feeling is wisdom. Acting on it automatically is just reaction. Move not unless you see an advantage. Use not your troops unless there is something to be gained. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The Original Wisdom. Chapter 12 opens with something concrete. Sun Tzu catalogs 5 targets for fire attack and lists the conditions required: the right season, the right weather, the right wind. Fire is an extraordinary weapon, but only when deployed with precision, preparation, and an absolute understanding of the conditions. Then he says something that elevates the chapter from tactics to wisdom: after the fire starts, wait for it to reach its height before you move. The impulse to act the moment something dramatic happens is precisely the impulse he is restraining. 3 tests should precede every significant action. Is there genuine advantage? Is there something real to gain? Is the situation genuinely critical? And then the passage that makes this chapter important: anger may in time change to gladness. But a kingdom that has once been destroyed can never come again into being. Some things, once done, cannot be undone. The core principles. The emotional state is real. Its intensity is real. The feeling that action is urgently required is real. And yet, the feeling will change. 3 tests should precede every action taken from a strong emotional state: genuine advantage, something real to gain, situation genuinely critical. The discipline is not suppression. It is feeling the full intensity while simultaneously holding the question: is this the moment to act, or the moment to wait? Some things you do in the fire of a difficult moment become part of how you see yourself, and not always in useful ways. The irreversibility of certain internal actions, things said, bridges burned, decisions made at peak desperation, must be weighed before they are taken, not after. Applying it in your mind. The internal version of this chapter is about one of the most fundamental and most difficult aspects of being a person: the relationship between your emotional states and your actions, specifically, the gap between feeling something intensely and letting that feeling dictate what you do. Sun Tzu's observation about anger and irreversibility is a complete theory of emotional regulation disguised as military strategy. The emotional state is real. The intensity is real. The feeling that action is urgently required is real. And yet, the feeling will change. The anger will soften. The humiliation will fade. The certainty that this is unbearable will, with time, reveal itself as an intense but temporary experience rather than a permanent truth. What will not change is what you did while the feeling was at its peak. The discipline being asked for here is not suppression, the pretense that the fire does not exist or does not matter. It is the far more demanding practice of feeling the full intensity of the emotional state while simultaneously holding the question: is this the moment to act, or is this the moment to wait? This is one of the hardest things a human being can do. It runs directly against the grain of how strong emotions function. They are specifically designed to produce urgent action, to feel like they require an immediate response, to make waiting feel intolerable. The 3 tests applied to internal fire decisions are a practical tool for the moments when the impulse to act is strongest. Not do I feel like doing this, that question is answered by the emotion, which is not a reliable guide at peak intensity. But, does acting on this, in this way, at this moment, serve something I actually care about? Is there a concrete positive outcome this action is designed to achieve? And is the situation genuinely requiring action now, or is the urgency a product of the emotional state rather than the actual circumstances? The irreversibility principle, applied internally, is about the relationship between actions and the self-story they create. Some things you do, in the fire of a difficult moment, become part of how you see yourself, and not always in useful ways. The impulsive decision made at peak desperation that you spend years second-guessing. The bridge burned in anger that you find yourself grieving long after the anger passed. These are the internal consequences of fire used without the conditions being right. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify your personal fire signature, the specific emotional state, the specific type of situation that most reliably produces your impulsive responses. Describe it precisely. What does it feel like in your body? What thought pattern accompanies it? What does it make you want to do? Then design one specific pause, a physical action, a question you ask yourself, or rule you have pre-committed to, that you can deploy in that specific state before you act. The pause does not have to be long. It has to be real. The most powerful version of you is not the one who acts on every fire, it is the one who can hold the full intensity of a difficult moment and still choose whether to burn. Chapter 13. The use of intelligence. The most important intelligence operation you will ever run is directed at yourself. Foreknowledge cannot be elicited from spirits, it must be obtained from men who know the enemy's situation. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. The original wisdom. Sun Tzu closes The Art of War with a chapter about knowledge, specifically, the unglamorous, essential work of finding out what is actually true before you act on what you assume to be true. He opens with a statement that reframes every chapter that preceded it: no amount of theory, intuition, or abstract reasoning replaces real information from real sources. The quality of your decisions is bounded, absolutely, by the quality of your information. He writes about the converted spy, the most valuable of all intelligence assets, because a person who knows the situation from the inside can tell you things that no amount of external observation could reveal. He closes, without intelligence, nothing moves. Without accurate knowledge of the terrain, every principle in this book becomes a sophisticated way of acting on bad assumptions. The core principles. The most important intelligence operation in this book is the one directed inward. Your self-model, the picture of who you are, what you are capable of, what you value, was substantially formed some time ago and has been maintained largely through selective attention ever since. Information that challenges your self-model is the most valuable intelligence you can receive, and the most consistently filtered out. You cannot think your way to an accurate self-picture. You need real information, from real sources, received with genuine openness to let it change what you believed. The people who know you well enough to see you clearly, and trust you enough to tell you something true, are your most valuable intelligence assets. Applying it in your mind. The final and most important intelligence operation in this book is the one directed inward, the genuine, rigorous, ongoing work of finding out what is actually true about yourself, rather than operating on the story you have constructed about yourself over time. Most people have a self-model, a picture of who they are, what they are capable of, what they value, what they want, that was substantially formed some time ago and has been maintained largely through selective attention ever since. Information that confirms the model is registered and remembered. Information that challenges it is explained away, minimized, or simply not taken in. The consequence is that the self-model drifts gradually away from the actual self, becoming a maintained story rather than a current map. Sun Tzu's intelligence discipline applied internally begins with the same question he asks about any strategic situation: what is actually true here, and how do I know? Applied to yourself, this means taking seriously the feedback you receive that you do not like, not because all criticism is accurate, but because the consistent themes in critical feedback are almost always pointing at something real that the self-model has edited out. It means paying attention to the gap between what you say you value and what your actual choices demonstrate you value, because the choices are primary intelligence and the self-report is processed intelligence, and the processing always involves loss. The converted spy principle applied internally is one of the most powerful and most underused personal development tools available, finding people who have seen you from the outside, who know you well enough to have a real view, and who trust you enough to tell you something true, and then asking them the questions that your self-protective instincts would prefer to avoid. What do you see when you observe how I behave under pressure? What pattern do you notice in the things I consistently struggle with? What do I say I want that my behavior seems to contradict? These are intelligence questions. The answers are primary source material about the terrain of yourself. The foundational insight of the chapter, that foreknowledge cannot come from calculation or experience alone, but must come from real sources, applies to self-knowledge with its fullest force. You cannot think your way to an accurate self-picture. You cannot derive it from your own emotional states, which are not neutral observers of the territory. You need real information, from real sources, received with a genuine openness to let it change what you believed. This is the most difficult intelligence operation of all. It is also the one that everything else depends on. Field notes. Pause here to reflect, or return to these questions after the chapter. Identify one person in your life who knows you well enough to see you clearly and who you trust enough to tell you something true. Ask them one of the following questions, and then listen, without defending, explaining, or immediately reframing. What do you think is the thing I most consistently underestimate about myself? Or, what pattern do you notice in the situations where I get in my own way? Write down what they say before you evaluate it. Sit with it for at least 24 hours before you decide what to do with it. The intelligence you receive may be the most valuable you ever gather. All the strategy in the world is only as good as the information it stands on, and the most important information you will ever gather is the truth about what is actually happening in yourself, right now. Conclusion. The art of knowing yourself, what Sun Tzu was really teaching all along. You have now spent 13 chapters in the company of one of the most precise strategic minds in human history. And if this audiobook has done its job, you are finishing it not with a collection of interesting ideas about ancient warfare, but with a set of living tools for the actual conditions of your inner life. The one idea. At its deepest level, the art of war is about the relationship between clarity and action. Not action alone. Sun Tzu has no patience for the person who simply charges forward without having thought carefully. And not clarity alone, the person who understands everything perfectly but never commits, never moves, never brings their full self to bear at the decisive moment, achieves nothing. The entire book is a discipline for developing the kind of clarity that makes action effective, and the kind of action that clarity makes possible. Know yourself. Know the terrain. Know the conditions. Then move, decisively, at the right moment, with the right force, in the right direction. In the context of your inner life, that instruction becomes, know what is actually happening inside you. Know the terrain of your own psychology, your genuine strengths and genuine weak points, the conditions that bring out your best and worst, the patterns that run when you are not watching. Know the conditions you are actually operating in, rather than the conditions you tell yourself you are operating in. And then act, from that real knowledge, not from the story. What you now know. You know, from Chapter 1, that the bad decisions in your life were almost never made in the middle of deep reflection. They were made quickly, emotionally, and without the honest self-assessment that Sun Tzu insists on before any significant move. You know, from Chapter 2, that unresolved mental open loops, decisions unmade, resentments unprocessed, goals stalled, are supply lines stretched from home. They consume energy constantly without producing anything. And that matching your hardest work to your sharpest state is not self-indulgence. It is logistics thinking applied to your most important resource. You know, from Chapter 3, that the enemy you most need to defeat without fighting is the one inside your own head, the pattern, the trigger, the reaction that fires before you have chosen it. And that understanding what is driving a reaction before you respond to it is the highest order approach available. You know, from Chapter 4, that the most important personal work you will ever do is the work nobody sees, the foundation building, the resilience building, the quiet development of the internal stability that means you cannot be destroyed by a single hard season. You know, from Chapter 5, that creating conditions where the behavior you want becomes easier is more powerful and more sustainable than forcing it through willpower, and that timing your most important decisions to your best states is one of the highest leverage practices available. You know, from Chapter 6, that the most important map of weak points and strong points you will ever draw is of yourself, the conditions under which you genuinely excel and the conditions that reliably produce your worst. And that flowing toward your strengths rather than grinding against your weaknesses is not laziness. It is strategic intelligence. You know, from Chapter 7, that the obstacle that forces adaptation often produces a permanent capability that the smooth path never would have, and that the discipline of asking what does this make possible, before defaulting to despair or denial, is one of the most reliable predictors of your outcomes. You know, from Chapter 8, that the most dangerous rigid rules are the ones about yourself, the self-beliefs derived from limited evidence that have calcified into identity before they were properly tested. And that the ability to try without needing to look good, and to change course without experiencing it as failure, is psychological freedom that most people spend their whole lives approaching but never quite reaching. You know, from Chapter 9, that the gap between your presented internal reality and your actual one is often as wide as any external gap you are trying to read, and that your body, your behavior, and your patterns are telling you something true about the territory, if you are willing to pay real attention. You know, from Chapter 10, that the internal terrain you carry, the conditions under which you operate at your genuine best and worst, shapes every decision you make. And that most personal defeats come not from external circumstances but from the 6 internal failure modes, the ways you defeat yourself before any opponent has a chance. You know, from Chapter 11, that the level of resourcefulness, clarity, and genuine change that desperate ground unlocks is qualitatively different from anything comfortable ground produces, and that partial commitment to something that calls for full commitment produces the worst possible outcome, all of the cost, none of the breakthrough. You know, from Chapter 12, that the emotional state is real and its intensity is real, and that the feeling will change. What will not change is what you did while the feeling was at its peak. And that the most powerful version of you is not the one who acts on every fire, but the one who can hold the full intensity of a difficult moment and still choose whether to burn. And you know, from Chapter 13, that the most important intelligence operation you will ever run is directed at yourself, that your self-model is a maintained story rather than a current map, and that finding the people and practices that help you see yourself more accurately is the foundational work that everything else depends on. The practice. None of what Sun Tzu teaches becomes useful through listening alone. It becomes useful through practice, through the repeated, imperfect, gradually improving application of these principles to your actual thinking, your actual patterns, and your actual inner life. Every significant decision you face is an opportunity to ask, have I laid my plans? Have I thought about this honestly rather than reacting? Every strong emotional impulse is an opportunity to apply the 3 tests before you act. Every obstacle is an opportunity to ask what it makes possible rather than only how to remove it. This is not about becoming a cold, calculating, emotionally detached strategist of your own inner life. Sun Tzu was not cold. His insistence on genuine care for the people in his charge, on earning trust before demanding it, on the humanity of the relationship between commander and soldier, reflects a deeply warm understanding of what moves people and what earns genuine commitment. The discipline he teaches is in service of a fuller, more honest, more intentional life, not a more controlled or more defended one. The goal is to move through your own inner world with clarity, with genuine self-knowledge, and with the kind of patient, deliberate action that clarity makes possible. A final word. Sun Tzu ends the art of war with intelligence, with the insistence that everything depends on knowing what is actually true. After 13 chapters of strategic wisdom, the final message is, none of this works without honesty. That honesty, with yourself, about what is actually happening inside you, about the gap between the story and the territory, about the patterns that run when you are not watching, is the foundation the entire book rests on. You have the principles now. You have the framework. You have the field notes throughout as starting points for putting them into practice. The rest is yours. The battlefield is different now. The principles are not. And you, having listened this far, having sat with these ideas long enough to let them begin to take shape in relation to your actual inner life, are more prepared than most people who will ever face the internal battles you are about to walk back into. Go. Think before you move. Know the ground. Know yourself. And when the moment comes, act with full clarity. The general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service, is the jewel of the kingdom. Sun Tzu, The Art of War.